Picture a federal official at a desk. Not a villain, not a caricature, just a person with a government email address and a phone and a job to do. And that job on this particular day is to call Facebook and tell them that a post needs to come down. No subpoena, no court order, no law passed by Congress authorizing this, no public announcement, just a call. And on the other end of that call, a platform with 2 billion users makes a quiet decision to remove, suppress, or algorithmically bury a piece of content that an American citizen posted because they believed it was true. That happened, not once, thousands of times, about COVID origins, about the 2020 election, about the Hunter Biden laptop, about anything the federal government decided in its judgment qualified as misinformation. A word they got to define, enforce, and protect from challenge all at once. We know it happened because discovery in a federal lawsuit exposed it. We know it was wrong because last week, the government signed a document in federal court saying that it won't do it again for 10 years. That document is a confession, and almost nobody noticed. I'm Darren. This is Trap Check. Let's get into it. The case is called Missouri v. Biden, filed in 2022 by the Attorneys General of Missouri and Louisiana, along with private plaintiffs who had been directly deplatformed or suppressed. The allegation? The Biden administration had been systematically pressuring social media companies like Facebook, Instagram, X, LinkedIn, YouTube to remove or suppress constitutionally protected speech, not through law, through phone calls, through emails, through what the court filings would eventually describe as a vast operation emanating from the highest levels of government. Discovery is where it got real. When the plaintiffs got access to internal communications, what they found wasn't a few overzealous staffers sending the occasional flag. It was a coordinated infrastructure. The CDC calling platforms about COVID content. The Surgeon General's office running a pressure campaign around vaccine hesitancy posts. And CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, which you probably know from its role in election security, running what they internally called switchboarding operations. Here's what switchboarding actually was. State and local election officials would flag social media posts they considered problematic. CISA would collect those flags, bundle them, and relay them to the platforms. But, and this is the part that broke the legal argument for the government, CISA wasn't just passing messages. CISA was telling the platforms whether the flagged content was true or false. They were making the call, and the platforms were acting on CISA's determination, not their own independent review. So the government wasn't just flagging content, the government was deciding what was true. And the platforms were outsourcing their content moderation to that determination. Which means when your post got removed for misinformation, the entity that decided it was misinformation wasn't the platform, it was a federal agency. Now, the government's defense, and they made this argument seriously with a straight face, was that they were just flagging, just offering perspective, just engaging in the kind of informal government-private sector communication that happens all the time. No coercion, no pressure, voluntary cooperation. The Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals looked at that argument and said CISA's interactions with platforms went well beyond flagging. CISA used its frequent contact and its authority to pressure platforms into adopting moderation policies that reflected CISA's view of what was true. When platforms acted on CISA switchboarded content, they weren't acting independently, they were acting under policies CISA had pressured them into adopting. That's not flagging, that's running the operation. And it wasn't just CISA. The scope of what discovery revealed ran from the CDC to the White House, the Surgeon General's office issuing what amounted to public pressure campaigns against platforms that weren't moving fast enough, internal government communications explicitly discussing the need to push harder, frustration expressed in writing when platforms didn't comply quick enough with removal requests. One more thing to think about. The content that got suppressed wasn't fringe material from anonymous accounts. It wasn't flat earthers and tin hat wearers. It included debate about COVID origins, which is now a mainstream discussion that multiple government agencies take seriously. It included the Hunter Biden laptop story, which multiple news organizations eventually confirmed was authentic. It included posts about election integrity from people who had legitimate, good faith concerns, even if you disagree with their conclusions. The government suppressed debate about things that turned out to be debatable, using the word misinformation as a label that stripped speech of protection, until last week when a federal court document confirmed that the label doesn't work that way. Misinformation, disinformation, malinformation. The consent decree says explicitly that applying those labels to speech does not make it constitutionally unprotected. That line is in the legal record now. The framework they used to justify the whole operation has been ruled illegitimate. Here's where the story gets complicated, because what happened to Missouri v. Biden in the courts is its own kind of trap. And understanding it matters for understanding why the settlement landing last week is bigger than it looks. The case moves fast, early. Judge Terry Daughtry, Western District of Louisiana, issues a sweeping preliminary injunction in 2023. He finds the plaintiffs have demonstrated likely First Amendment violations and bars a long list of government officials and agencies from contacting social media platforms to request content removal. It's a broad order, broader than almost anyone expected. The Fifth Circuit narrows it somewhat on appeal. Some agencies get removed from the list. The scope tightens, but the core finding, it holds. The government likely violated the First Amendment through its pressure campaign on platforms. Then it goes to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court agrees to hear the case, Murphy v. Missouri, at this stage, after the Biden administration appealed. And the oral arguments are genuinely interesting. The justices push both sides hard. There's a real engagement with the substance of what happened. And then in June of 2024, the Supreme Court dismisses the case, 6-3. Not on the merits, on standing. Standing is the legal doctrine that says to bring a lawsuit, you have to show that you were actually harmed by the specific actions of the specific defendants that you're suing. The majority found that the plaintiffs hadn't sufficiently traced their specific suppressions to specific government actions by specific officials. The causal chain wasn't tight enough to establish standing for these particular plaintiffs against these particular defendants. Which means the Supreme Court never ruled on whether what the government did was constitutional or not. The merits question, did the Biden administration violate the First Amendment, never got an answer from the highest court in the country. The case got sent home on a procedural ground. And that's where the trap closes for the first time. Because from the outside, what you saw was Supreme Court rules on Missouri v. Biden, case dismissed. And a lot of people heard that as a vindication, as the court's saying, nothing to see here, the government didn't do anything wrong. But that's not what the court said. The court said these specific plaintiffs didn't have standing to bring this specific case against these specific defendants. The behavior itself was never evaluated. So Biden leaves office, Trump comes in. On day one, Trump issues an executive order on restoring freedom of speech and ending federal censorship. The order specifically describes what happened under Biden, government actors exerting coercive pressure on social media platforms to suppress disfavored speech, and frames the new administration's position as correcting it. The Trump DOJ picks up the cases, engages with remaining litigation, and on March 24, 2026, just a couple weeks ago, the New Civil Liberties Alliance announces a settlement, a consent decree, court enforceable for 10 years. The CDC, CISA, and the Surgeon General's office are now legally prohibited from threatening social media companies with legal, regulatory, or economic punishment to get them to remove protected speech. Prohibited from unilaterally directing or vetoing platform content moderation decisions. Prohibited from doing what Discovery showed they spent years doing. Senator Eric Schmidt, who brought the original case as Missouri's Attorney General, called it the first real operational restraint on the federal censorship machine. Here's the line that matters most in the whole document. The consent decree states that government, politicians, media, academics, or anyone else applying labels such as misinformation, disinformation, or malinformation to speech does not render it constitutionally unprotected. They signed that in federal court. The government signed a document saying the framework that they used to justify years of platform pressure campaigns is constitutionally invalid. That's not a win on the merits. The Supreme Court still never ruled on the merits, but it's the next closest thing, Agencies don't accept decade-long behavioral restrictions on themselves because they think that their behavior was lawful. If the behavior was fine, you don't agree to stop doing it for 10 years. You fight, you win, you keep doing it. The settlement is a concession. Nobody said those words out loud, but the document said them. But here's the thing. Everything I just told you, the switchboarding, the suppression, the Supreme Court punt, the consent decree, this is not obscure information. It was covered. It got picked up. The Federalist covered it. The Hill covered it. The Washington Times covered it. Conservative outlets rang that bell hard. And then the news cycle moved on like it always does. No congressional hearings called. No primetime coverage on the networks that were, by the way, beneficiaries of a media environment where their competitors in independent and alternative spaces were getting suppressed, meaning like they were benefiting because new media like social media was getting suppressed. There was no moment of national reckoning. The confirmation of a years-long government pressure campaign against constitutionally protected speech landed, and within 48 hours, it was buried under whatever came next. Oh, that's no accident. That's the mechanism working. And I want to be clear that this mechanism doesn't require coordination. Nobody had to decide to bury this story. The outrage supply chain, and we're going to do a whole long-form episode on this, runs on exhaustion. It runs on the principle that if you flood the zone with enough allegations, enough controversies, enough breaking news, you can ensure that by the time the confirmation arrives, the audience has already spent their attention budget on the accusation. We saw the Twitter files in 2022. We had congressional hearings. We watched Matt Taibbi and Barry Weiss and Michael Schellenberger release thread after thread documenting exactly what the Missouri v. Biden discovery would later confirm through the legal process. There were news cycles, there was outrage, and then there was the next thing, and then the next thing after that. So when the consent decree dropped last week, when the actual legal confirmation arrived, court enforceable, signed by the government, admitting through action what it had never admitted through words, the audience was kind of numb. Not because they didn't care, because they already processed this story, or they thought they had back when it was just an allegation. The confirmation kind of felt like a rerun. That's the trap. The trap isn't that censorship happened. The trap isn't even that it got exposed. The trap is that the exposure is designed to exhaust rather than inform. Enough noise around the allegation that proof lands with no weight. By the time the document exists, the actual court document, signed, enforceable, admitting the behavior was wrong, the public awareness cycle has already moved through outrage, past fatigue, and into the category of things we vaguely remember being upset about one time. Think about what that means for the next operation, because there will be a next operation, not necessarily by the same agencies, not necessarily using the same mechanisms, but the playbook, government pressure on private platforms to suppress disfavored speech, wrapped in public health or election security language. That playbook has been used. It worked for years before it got exposed, and the exposure, when it finally came, produced a news cycle instead of a reckoning. If you were designing the next version of this operation, what would you change? You'd probably run it faster, move more quickly before discovery can catch up, use more intermediaries so the casual chain is harder to trace, make the pressure more informal so there's less in writing, and you'd count on the fact that even if it gets exposed, the confirmation will land into an audience that's already been exhausted by the allegation. The consent decree is a win. I mean that. A court-enforceable 10-year prohibition on 3 specific agencies from engaging in this specific behavior, that is real, structural restraint. Senator Schmidt is right that it's the first operational check on this machinery. That does matter. But a win that nobody noticed is a half win at best, because the point of understanding what happened isn't just accountability for the past, it's pattern recognition for the future. If you don't know how the mechanism works, if you didn't absorb the confirmation because you were already numb from the allegation, you won't recognize the next version of it when it runs. And that's why we're here, not to relitigate what happened, to make sure that the pattern is clear enough that you see it the next time someone at a federal agency picks up a phone and calls a platform and tells them a post needs to come down. The phone call already happened. Now you know what it was. I'm Darren. This has been Trap Check. Stay curious, stay honest, and stay human. And I'll see you next week. Thanks.